My name is Eeva-Liisa Pelkonen, and on behalf of my co-organizers, Michael Slabs and Anya Bakov, I would like to welcome you all for this Centennial Symposium. It is a great honor to have President Salovey join us tonight, and he will introduce tonight's speaker.
Thank you, Eeva-Liisa. Good evening, everybody. The way you said that, it's as if we don't know who tonight's speaker is. But I think we all have a suspicion of who it might be. And so I'm really pleased to be here and honored to be here on this occasion, not only because of the wonderful Yale history that will be embodied in Dean Stern's lecture, and I should add the book that accompanies with it, and you did a fantastic job getting this done. Thank you. But also because it's really an opportunity to celebrate the School of Architecture and the Dean's legacy within the school. I think you all know this has been an incredible 18-year term. It concludes in June, and we are just indebted, let me say to you, Bob, not refer to you in the third person, for all that you have achieved in leading the school to the position of excellence that it holds today. It's been an amazing deanship. I think many of you who are familiar with academic tradition know that an 18-year deanship is a very unusual event. Typically, deans serve for 5, and then you sort of beg them, maybe they'll do another 5. And then usually after that second 5, you push them out. But the 18-year tradition reflects I think, a shared intransigence. That is, I couldn't have been more delighted that when I became president, Dean Stern was in the saddle, was one of our most experienced deans, was a model for others, and was leading the school, I think, to such great heights. We're fortunate to know that we'll be able to build on his terrific record with the oversight of his successor, Deborah Burke. And I think many of you know Dean Designate Burke, who's with us tonight, and we welcome you. Before I speak a little bit to Dean Stern's excellent 18 years, I do want to acknowledge a few people who have helped us, particularly with the school. So to the Miller family for its generosity in establishing the J. Irwin Miller Fund, which supports the symposium that this lecture is a part of. To my predecessor as Yale's president, Rick Levin, and to the 4th Century Trust for enabling the publication of the book that shares the symposium's name, Pedagogy in Place, 100 Years of Architecture Education at Yale. And as I alluded to earlier, Bob did that book jointly with Jimmy Stamp, who's with us tonight too. The School of Architecture really holds a vital place within this university and really within the world. We're incredibly proud of this school and that it plays such a leadership role in guiding the discipline of architecture as a whole. What happens at the Yale School of Architecture matters to the field of architecture, is important to the world of architecture, and that is the role that a school at a great university should play in its field or profession. As I mentioned during Dean Stern's nearly 2 years at the helm of the school, it's been a period of outstanding accomplishment and growth. So for example, there's been a reinvigoration of the school's curriculum, establishing it as the center stage of contemporary architecture discourse. There's been some terrific fundraising success, new endowment funds totaling more than $104 million that enhance our financial aid for students, that expand the school's visiting critic system, that support international travel for students in design studios and seminars, and ensure the continued success of the school's groundbreaking design build program, the Gym Block First Year Building Project. I suspect that some of the people responsible for some of what I just ticked off are with us tonight, and I thank you for your support of the school. The school, also under the dean's leadership, has developed an expansive publications program, enables the school to document studio art of its students, document faculty research, and architecture criticism. Under Dean Stern's leadership, there's been the implementation of a robust and acclaimed gallery program that features exhibitions from peer institutions as well as ones that originate right here at Yale. And of course, we are sitting in the Hastings Auditorium of the restored Paul Rudolph Hall, a restoration project that was carried out under Bob's leadership that has really, I think, created a renewed appreciation for brutalism and for this building in particular. I remember, I'm a psychologist and not an expert in architecture, although I'm an appreciator of architecture, and I remembered having mixed feelings about this building until the day I went back for the reopening. And I saw the orange carpets, and I saw the mid-century furnishings, and I saw the way these materials work against each other. And I sort of saw the whole thing in a way that I had never seen it before. And it's just great having that experience as a novice, where you say, I see what he was going for, I see what he was trying to do. And I think many of us had lost that, and it was so great to recover that in the renovation of this building. Under Bob's watchful eye. So he is a man who needs no introduction, despite my having gone on at a little bit of length there. That is a cliche I use reluctantly. The last time I said, here is a man who needs no introduction, I was referring to Henry Kissinger. And I know Bob is thinking, that's all? But who is he again? But Henry Kissinger was sitting right here. And I said, and now I'd like to introduce a man who needs no introduction. And I hear the banging on the stage of a cane, and it's Henry's cane. You know, he's 92 years old now. And this was about a year ago. He's banging his cane on the stage, and he leans into the microphone and he says, Peter, I may be a man who needs no introduction, but I am also a man who likes to listen to one. So you know, when you have on your sheet, here is a man who needs no introduction, you generally haven't written out an introduction. So I sort of made one up for him on the fly. But this is a man who needs no introduction, but he is a man to whom we are so grateful, so appreciative. I am proud to call him both a friend and a colleague. We were fellow deans together for a number of years, actually about 7 of those years. And you have my deep gratitude. You have the deep gratitude of everyone in this room. And you especially have the deep gratitude of the larger Yale community. We bask in the reflected glory of this school and are so appreciative for what you have done for it. So please join me now in welcoming our Dean, Dean Robert Stern. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you. I shall now enjoy being the Henry Kissinger of architecture.
That's right.
Thank you so much. Peter has an unavoidable conflict, which he already adjusted in, as only presidents of universities can get away with, but he has to take care of business, as they say. I thank him so much for the introduction, and I thank you all for coming. And there are many people watching this in other rooms. I'm sorry we can't all be in the same room together, but those of us who are deans, like Deborah Wilby and I, know that it's not always possible to fill even this room up. So I'm thrilled to see you here. I want to reiterate what Peter said, that this is the kickoff for the Irwin Miller Symposium, Learning, Doing, Thinking, Educating Architects in the 21st Century, which has been convened by our esteemed colleague, Eva Lisa Pelkonen. And it helps commemorate 100 years of architecture education at Yale. But first, I'd like to say a few words about Irwin Miller. Irwin Miller, J. Irwin Miller, B.A. of 1931, had a love and respect for architecture that took many forms, including his close collaboration with Eero Saarinen, with Kevin Roach, whom I'm delighted is here with us tonight, and Caesar Pelli, who is also here, and on many private and public projects in Mr. Miller's home city of Columbus, Indiana. As a member of the Yale Corporation, he made sure that architecture flourished in the university through stewardship, patronage, and the support of this school, the importance of which he understood perhaps better than anyone in the university community. In 1976, Mr. Miller wrote, "A distinguished school of architecture is important to Yale and to the nation. Yale is concerned more than most universities with the conservation and the constant restatement of human values in a society containing so many dehumanizing forces. Architecture is concerned with the kind of visual life we will lead. It is thus an indispensable component of humane education, and indeed of civilized human existence as well." He went on to say that the Yale School of Architecture continues to influence this country to a degree quite out of proportion to its small size. It is not an easy task which a school has to perform. The undertaking to recruit the most talented young men and women of each generation and give them personal exposure to the best faculty of their times will always be expensive. This is the pitch that he was making, but I'm happy to make it on his behalf to those who can. Throughout man's history, however, there has been no other way to teach the best and to teach them well. Such schools are generations in the making, yet can be lost overnight. We are indebted to Mr. Miller's children for the generous gift of endowment that makes these symposia a permanent part of Yale's architectural culture. It's a great honor for me to speak to you today, although it pains me that this will be one of the last opportunities I'll have to hold court at the lectern as dean, and how I have enjoyed it. This talk grows from research I conducted with Jimmy Stamp, who's here with us tonight, MED class of 2011, for our book on the history of the school's architecture, pedagogy, and place, and the exhibition that is now upstairs in view in the gallery. And I'm happy to say that Jimmy and I will be happy to sign copies of the book after the lecture, as is customary in these things. My talk today is little more than a broad survey of the school's pedagogy and the buildings that have housed it. In the brief time allotted, I will discuss key faculty, administrators, and students who in their individual ways help illuminate that story. But to begin, please indulge me in a brief discussion of three pedagogical models which have dominated architecture education in the West over the last 250 years. The first, combining apprenticeship with formal training, is represented by the practice of English architect Sir John Soane, who flourished in the early 19th century. Wanting to perpetuate architecture as a family business, Soane began planning an academy when his son George was born in 1790. He designed his villa, Pitzhanger Manor, as an environment to help introduce the boy into the profession. Unfortunately, little John Soane showed no interest in architecture, like my son Nick here, came here for 1 week. Doesn't always work when you have kids, let me tell you. Rather than being discouraged, the eldest son grew more dedicated to his legacy and established a formal program of architectural education in a new London home at 12 Lincoln's Inn Field. Many of you have visited it, no doubt. A demanding teacher, he required 12 days from his students, who absorbed the language of classicism by making carefully measured technical drawings and elaborate representations of ornament, usually drawn from casts in Soane's extensive collection. Once Soane began teaching at the Royal Academy, his students prepared drawings for his lectures, such as this illustration comparing the sizes of famous domes, beginning with Soane's own Bank of England and culminating in the Dome of St. Peter's. Both Soane's office and the school died with him. Frank Lloyd Wright's mother, Anna Lloyd Wright, Anna Lloyd Jones, as actually we called herself, was more successful in setting her infant son on a path toward becoming an architect. She surrounded his baby room with engravings of Gothic cathedrals. Nearly 100 years after Soane's death, Frank Lloyd Wright would adopt the idea of an academy built around the work of a single master, establishing his own school at Taliesin in Arizona in 1932, and in Wisconsin both. A second model, the Polytechnic, is best represented by the Bau Academy in Berlin, which treated architecture as a matter of tectonics and prepared students to serve the state as engineers. The Bau Academy evolved into one of the most influential architecture schools in Europe, particularly after Carl Friedrich Schinkel, a former student at the Bau Academy, designed a new, technically straightforward brick structure to house the school, completed in 1836. The Bau Academy would have a significant, if limited, influence on American architecture, most notably at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, through the remarkable career of Nathan Ricker. As a student in 1870, Ricker, working under Bau Academy-trained architect Harold Hansen, crafted an architecture program based on mathematics and technical drawing. Ricker would go on to found and lead the new architecture department. So he's the only architect who was a student who then went on to become to create the department. Obviously, a man of great genius and energy. Ricker's program adhered to the tectonic approach of the Polytechnic, and to a considerable extent, the school does so to this day. Beginning in the 1930s, the pedagogy that the German emigre Mies van der Rohe brought to the Illinois Institute of Technology closely echoed that of the Bau Academy. And Ricker, Kevin Roach once told me that he'd gone to the study with Mies after coming to the United States from Ireland, and I said, "Why? How long did you stay?" He said, "I stayed 1 year. I got it." The third pedagogical model, and the one to have had the most profound impact on Yale and on architecture and education in the United States in general, was that of the French École des Beaux-Arts. With roots in 17th century royal patronage, the history of the école is somewhat convoluted, but by the early 19th century, it had evolved into what many consider the greatest school of architecture in history. From 1839 onward, the école was, like the Bau Academy, headquartered in a central building that reflected its pedagogy. The Palais des Études, designed by Félix Dubin, incorporated architectural fragments into the facade, making the building itself a lecture in architectural history. A lecture or a lesson that continued on the interior, much of which was dedicated to the exhibition of large-scale plaster casts. Students at the Beaux-Arts studied construction and mathematics as at the Bau Academy, but the principal thrust of the program was on the history of architecture, on composition, and formal language. I'm sure Barry Bergdahl will illuminate and probably correct me tomorrow in the symposium. Like Sohn's students, those at the Beaux-Arts were trained to draw beautifully, to measure and represent existing buildings, to recreate from partial evidence destroyed works of the past. But they were also required to take on their own individual projects according to programs prepared by the school, initiating them with designs sketched in a cubicle, typically over a 12-hour period, and then developed over 3 to 6 months. In 1846, Richard Morris Hunt was the first American to study at the École des Beaux-Arts. When he returned to the States in 1855, he established a short-lived New York atelier modeled on what he had experienced in France, inspiring one of his students, William Robert Ware, to establish America's first formal program in architecture at MIT, in a newly created institution itself, in 1865. Ironically, though MIT was a school of engineering, which it remains to this day, Ware's architecture program was modeled on that of the Beaux-Arts, which for 75 years dominated American architectural education, with most programs housed, as at MIT, in engineering schools. Yale, though a comparative latecomer among its peers, followed a distinctly different pattern, with a program developed in a school of fine arts, founded in 1869 as the first such school situated in an American institution of higher learning. As founding director of the School of the Fine Arts, the noted landscape painter, John Ferguson Weir, deliberately modeled Yale on the École des Beaux-Arts, adopting the name School of the Fine Arts as a literal translation of the French institution's name. From the beginning, architecture at Yale was seen as an artistic pursuit rather than a technical discipline. The new Yale School was intended as a school of painting, sculpture, and architecture all in one, as well as an art museum. Weir, whose brother had attended the École, believed that the greatest benefit of the French school's methodology was the studio system, which in his view encouraged healthy competition and camaraderie. In contrast to many other architecture programs, which were housed in retrofitted spaces originally built for other purposes, for example, the studios at Penn were for many years housed in a former dental clinic. Torture is torture, I suppose. Weir was fortunate to be able to situate his newly established art school in a building specifically designed for its pedagogical purpose, incorporating studios, a library, and gallery space. A lack of funds initially prevented the establishment of a full architecture program at Yale. But in the late 1870s, as post-war Civil War Yale College evolved from a provincial college status dominated by religious studies into a multidisciplinary research university, courses in drawing and architecture history began to be offered to undergraduates. However, would-be architects in Yale College, such as James Gamble Rogers, Grosvenor Atterbury, and William Adams Delano, were nonetheless forced to supplement their studies elsewhere, typically at Columbia, in order to prepare for the rigorous entrance examinations of the École des Beaux-Arts. A larger course of study on architecture was established at Yale in 1908, thanks to the testamentary bequest of Professor James M. Hoppin, but it was not until 1916 that the program developed into a full department within the school, hence today's centenary celebration. From its beginning, the location of the architecture department inside the School of the Fine Arts made it different from all other American programs, because the presence of painting, sculpture, and architecture students under one roof enabled collaboration between disciplines, exemplified by the introduction of the correlated design problem, which required an architecture, painting, and sculpture student to work together on a single design. an innovation likely modeled on a similar studio at the recently founded American Academy in Rome. Of course, the architecture students would design the building, and they really only wanted the painters to sort of smear something on the wall and the sculptors to put a little plaque up. Nonetheless, the term collaborative would later be adopted in Yale's program and become nationally famous and a hallmark of the school from the 1920s to the late 1950s, as you can see in these photos taken around 1950. In 1916, Everett Victor Meeks was named the first chairman of the newly formalized architecture department. A graduate of Yale College and the École des Beaux-Arts, Meeks had worked for Carrere and Hastings in New York, the Hastings of this very auditorium, and had taught at Cornell. In addition to serving as the first architecture chairman, after 1922, he also served as dean of the School of the Fine Arts, responsible for all its programs, which by then also included drama and art history, as well as the art gallery. For over 20 years, and by the way, I wanted to outlive Meeks, but that's not possible in the job. I don't know how he did it. It was amazing. For over 20 years, Meeks was not only a powerful force at Yale, but also the leading advocate of the Beaux-Arts system in America. When the United States entered the First World War, just after Meeks was appointed, Meeks served in France. When he returned from Europe, he was convinced that the Beaux-Arts as an institution would not be able to recover its glory in the aftermath of the war, and that Yale, as the only American school to combine multidisciplinary training in the arts, could become not just the American equivalent of the École des Beaux-Arts, but the French school's successor. Under Meeks, Yale adopted French methods to American practice and quickly established a reputation for excellence, joining with other national architecture programs to participate in the New York-based Beaux-Arts Institute of Design, which prepared and subsequently judged competitive design problems, establishing thereby a national standard for architectural education. Recognizing that New Haven was not exactly a major center for architectural discourse in those years, but near enough to New York to draw the best talent on a short-term basis, Meeks established an early and informal version of the visiting critic system that by the 1940s would become one of the defining characteristics of Yale's pedagogy. While many peer institutions such as Harvard and Yale imported French graduates of the École to serve as design professors, Meeks, believing that these resident Frenchmen had little understanding of American practice, preferred to hire American graduates of the École des Beaux-Arts who were active as practicing architects. As a result, Yale, perhaps more than any other school, intertwined artistic and professional leadership as its pedagogical goal, a goal pursued to create leaders in the practice of architecture. Initially, Meeks, who maintained a small practice in New York, was in charge of the advanced design studios. But when he became dean, he surrendered this responsibility to Otto Failton, head designer in the office of James Gamble Rogers, and the man generally credited with the design of Harkness Tower. Failton, a graduate of MIT and the École des Beaux-Arts, proved to be both a brilliant teacher and a colorful character, and beloved as a bibulous gentleman who, according to students, was best in his cups, which likely led to his departure from Yale in 1933, which is rather sad. That's just when booze became legal again. Failton completed his teaching career at Penn, interestingly enough, which remained a solidly Beaux-Arts institution until the 1950s. With Failton's departure, Meeks brought in Raymond Hood, a surprising but inspired choice. Hood was one of the most open-minded and stylistically progressive architects in America. Meeks found in Hood a perfect response to the increasingly vocal student requests for a more modern approach. But his Beaux-Arts training put the conservative Meeks at ease. A leading skyscraper architect, Hood's Daily News and McCraw-Hill buildings, as well as his Dobbs Ferry apartment tower project, were included in Hitchcock and Johnson's groundbreaking 1932 exhibition on modern architecture. Hood, the first American architect of consequence to take Le Corbusier's work seriously, in particular his ideas about urban design, brought to Yale a cosmopolitan modernism grounded in American pragmatism. Regrettably, Hood died in 1934, aged 54, forcing Meeks to search for someone of comparable stature who could respond to students' demands for a curriculum that addressed a rapidly changing culture. Demands brought about by the Great Depression and by the dramatic pedagogical changes taking place after 1936 at Harvard, which established its Beaux-Arts curriculum in favor of a modernist program led by Walter Gropius. Meeks was personally reluctant to embrace anti-historical modernism as Harvard had, but he understood the need for change. After a few lackluster interim appointments, in 1938, he found his perfect successor to Hood in Wallace K. Harrison, who in turn brought with him to teach at the school a German-Swiss architect who had worked for Le Corbusier. His name was Oskar Nitschke. Harrison and Nitschke, who were in close contact with French modernist artists, brought a welcome cosmopolitanism to the program, encouraging innovative thinking in design. In 1939, Meeks expanded the curriculum to include a program in city planning, led by architect-planner William Parsons, a graduate of Yale and the Beaux-Arts. Unfortunately, Parsons died shortly after the appointment, but students George Dudley and Maynard Meyer decided to remain at Yale after graduating in architecture to work under Harrison to organize the planning program. When Meeks became chairman in 1916, Street Hall, home of the art school, was 50 years old and hopelessly overburdened. I think I skipped 1 year. No? Something slipped away. Well, it'll come up. Yeah, there it is. And hopelessly overburdened. As a result, he immediately began to lobby the university for funds to expand the school's facilities in accord to a master plan designed as a thesis by a student, Hyman I. Feldman, class of 1920. As a result of Meeks's lobbying and Feldman's inspired conception of the school's future, the university agreed to relocate the architecture department into an unfinished building, which was completed and renamed Weir Hall in honor of the school's founding director. It's now at the back of the courtyard behind the art gallery. It's now part of Jonathan Edwards College. Also called for in the Feldman plan was an expansive new art gallery, which was partly realized in 1928, freeing Street Hall for the exclusive use of painting and sculpture students. James Gamble Rogers was initially approached to design the new museum, but the commission was ultimately awarded to another Yale College graduate, Egerton Swarthout, who developed a grand Romanesque-inspired scheme for a building spanning an entire block. In this early image of the building, you see the sculpture hall on the lower right, and in it you see Minerva, goddess of wisdom and craft, who would reemerge years later as the centerpiece of the art and architecture building. In the department's early years, many of the students came from Yale College, like the multifaceted George Nelson, class of 1928, who, wandering into Weir Hall one day to get out of the rain, was awestruck by the student drawings on display. Later on, Dean Meeks would tell him his drawings were terrible, but they impressed Nelson, who went on to win the Prix de Rome, enjoy a celebrated career as an architect, journalist, and designer. In 1938, when Harrison convened a conference of housing experts at Yale to discuss the latest technical developments in the field, Nelson designed the accompanying exhibition, the first of many he would design in his long and productive career. By no means did all the early students come from Yale College. Yen Liang, class of 1931, was the school's first Chinese student. After graduating, Liang went on to become Frank Lloyd Wright's first apprentice at Taliesin, where by day he worked on the farm and designed under the master, and by night entertained the fellowship with violin concertos. Eero Saarinen, class of 1934, also came from an atypical background as the son of the eminent Finnish architect Ylio Saarinen, designer and director of the Cranbrook Academy, a campus comparable in romanticism and urbanity to Yale's recently completed Harkness Memorial Quadrangle. After a year studying sculpture in Paris, Eero was admitted to Yale on the basis of a letter his father wrote to Dean Meeks, asking if his under-credentialed son could enroll. Admission was quite a bit easier in those days. Meeks accepted Ylio's boy immediately, a wise decision. Eero quickly proved his mettle as a brilliant draftsman and designer, winning numerous awards and exhibiting a mastery of both traditional and modern styles. Other notable students of Meeks's middle years include Donald McLaughlin, a classmate of Saarinen's who is best known as the designer of the United Nations logo. Or Harold Rome, BFA 1934, who went on to success as a Broadway musical composer. And Wesley Cheek Jr., a Harvard College graduate, who came to Yale because of the architecture department's close collaboration with the drama department, for which he would design sets. Cheek would go on to a leading career as a museum director known for his innovative exhibition design. World War II pretty much ground the department to a halt. When Meeks reached mandatory retirement age in 1947, Charles Sawyer was appointed dean. Though Sawyer came from the museum world, he had good instincts regarding art and architecture education, and secured the services of George Howe as chairman of the Department of Architecture and former Bauhaus master Joseph Albers as chairman of the Department of Art. George Howe was an ideal choice to help Yale with the transition from the Beaux-Arts era to architectural modernism, because he had made the same transition himself. The École de Beaux-Arts trained Howe began his career designing widely admired traditional country houses, before partnering in the late 1920s with William Lescaz to design the Philadelphia Saving Fund Society building, a landmark in 20th century modernism. At the time of his appointment, Howe was one of the most prominent American-born architects associated with the modern movement. Albers and Howe became great friends and comrades in arms, each helping the other transform their respective departments into ones more reminiscent of those found at the much-admired Bauhaus, the German school of arts and crafts and industrial design founded, as you all know, by Walter Gropius. At the time Howe and Albers embarked on reforming Yale's curriculum and the profession, the public had come to regard Harvard's Graduate School of Design, then still led by Gropius, as the American Bauhaus, despite the fact that Harvard had no programs in painting, none in sculpture or design. Not much of a Bauhaus, it seems to me. Yale, on the other hand, with programs in all the arts, naturally seemed better suited to take on the mantle of the much admired but defunct German school. In the wake of World War II, as GIs flooded into Yale, temporary architecture studios were established in the gallery's sculpture hall and in nearby storefronts. Searching for a more permanent solution, it was decided to expand the art gallery, not according to the originally intended design, but with an entirely new, entirely modernist addition designed by a relatively obscure faculty member who Howe had mentored, Louis I. Kahn, a classically trained modernist from Philadelphia. The art gallery extension was Kahn's first substantial project. It was also the first modern building at Yale. It opened in 1953, providing classroom, workshop, and studio space for both art and architecture students who could study in a building that significantly contributed to the redefinition of modern architecture. In shaping Yale's new curriculum in architecture, Howe relied on three very different architects who can be seen as representing aspects of his own personal philosophy. Philip Johnson, the designer historian, Louis Kahn, the artist philosopher, and Eugene Nall, the primitivist builder. In the 1950s, all three men had an extraordinary influence on students. Johnson, though perceived to be an arch modernist, introduced issues of the past, famously shocking students with the admonition, "You cannot not know history." On the assumption that style was all important, Johnson, in full rebellion against his Harvard education under Walter Gropius, asked students to design a house in the manner of Frank Lloyd Wright, then to design it in the manner of Le Corbusier, then to design it in the manner of Mies van der Rohe. And then at the end of the term, there was a short moment when the student could turn to his own resources. Here you see Duncan Buell's house in the manner of Frank Lloyd Wright. Buell, class of 1953, would go on to become one of Louis Kahn's chief associates. In addition to Johnson, Howe relied on Louis Kahn, who arrived at Yale in 1947, actually before Howe was appointed, and his arrival was something of an accident. Virtually unknown, he was called in as a last-minute replacement for Brazilian architect Oscar Niemeyer. As an avowed communist, Niemeyer was prevented from teaching by the United States government. It was Kahn who had first proposed Howe as the new chairman. Kahn was a guru-like teacher, fond of opaque aphorisms. But as a former student of Paul Cray's at Penn, he was also thoroughly imbued with Beaux-Arts pedagogy, and thereby both willing and able to rejuvenate Yale's stagnant collaborative studio. Teaching alongside Albers and Johnson, Kahn made sure that architecture, painting, and sculpture students worked with modern forms and materials and worked together. If Kahn was the guru, Eugene Nall, class of 1948, was the cult leader. One of the more misunderstood personalities in the school's history, Nall initially trained as a cabinet maker before military service in World War II. While recovering from injuries sustained during the war, he applied to Yale, and though he was less than credentialed, had no famous father to make a phone call, gained Nice's support based on the strength of his drawing skills. Later, Howe worked closely with Nall in preparing a new core curriculum, eventually empowering him with complete control over the first few years of the program. Nall favored natural materials like stone and timber, and students were often required to show how trees would be cut down and processed to realize their designs. In fact, Nall would work with students over the summer to develop all the programs, and it was in both a deep exploration and a very restrictive approach. Here you can see the Lyman House in Malibu. Fred Lyman was a graduate of this period. The house is 1960. It perfectly reflects Mall's primitivist pedagogy. Howe not only invigorated and to an extent transformed the curriculum, he also dramatically expanded the department's impact on the discipline, most notably by founding and helping to fund Perspecta, the Yale Architectural Journal. From the publication of its first issue in 1952, Perspecta's student editors have gathered historical and contemporary material in an ongoing effort to shape architectural discourse. Perspecta has never pushed any single agenda. As Howe famously put it, to all architects, teachers, students, Perspecta offers a place on the merry-go-round. Howe was forced to retire in 1954. Regrettably, his hand-picked successor, Paul Schweiker, lacked the charm and leadership capabilities to maintain harmony among the fractious and opinionated faculty. A small committee was formed with the charismatic young art historian Vincent Scully playing a key role in a search for a new, strong design leader. The 40-year-old Paul Rudolph immediately impressed the selection committee with his clarity of vision and dedication to architecture. Based in Florida, Rudolph was widely known as a stimulating studio critic and had been invited to succeed Mies van der Rohe at IIT, but declined to accept the position because he would have felt too beholden to Mies's pedagogy. In 1958, when he took over as chairman in the renamed and reorganized Yale School of Art and Architecture, Rudolph's professional career, hitherto almost exclusively focused on residential work, was taking off with major projects such as the Jewett Art Center at Wellesley College. Both as an employer and a teacher, Rudolph was an exacting taskmaster, alternately feared and loved. His dedication to architecture was total. As Alan Greenberg has put it, with only slight exaggeration, there was no man Paul Rudolph, there was just architect Paul Rudolph. Arguably, the most dynamic, challenging, and important architectural educator of the time, Rudolph led Yale to international acclaim, regularly gathering diverse visitors to serve as studio teachers and design jurors, selected for their unique and often conflicting points of view. But it was Rudolph's own words that set the course for students, own work, I should have said, who saw him as a hero architect struggling to move architecture forward by synthesizing the lessons of the great modern masters while also holding contemporary architecture up to the standards of the past. Rudolph's impact on students was electrifying. Everyone tried at least once to imitate the new chairman, including Stanley Tigerman presenting his thesis for an apartment tower in Chicago, and Der Scott, whose project for housing owes a clear debt to Rudolph's design for married student housing here at Yale. Somehow went too far. There's Der Scott's project. Two Englishmen, Norman Foster and Richard Rogers, during their 1961 to 1962 year in the postgraduate master's class, were also deeply influenced by Rudolph, especially by his open manner and his energy. Above this photo of Foster and Rogers is the megastructural design they prepared under Rudolph as a proposal for the Pearson Sage Science Complex, what we call Science Hill. Anecdotally, we call it that. Then being designed by Philip Johnson. Though they were dazzled by Rudolph, Foster and Rogers found an intellectual mentor in Serge Chemaev, Rudolph's complete opposite, whom he had brought to Yale to focus on research-level design. Here we see a plan for a new city completed by Foster Rogers and two others studying under Serge Chemaev. Rudolph's greatest legacy was his masterpiece, the uncompromising art and architecture building for which he was both architect and talent, and in which we sit tonight. Reviving the pedagogical vision of John Ferguson Weir, to teach all the fine arts under a single roof. The Art and Architecture Building, somehow these things get bad. They seem to have their own genius. Well, maybe not. Thank you, Jimmy. Yes, somehow we got those out of order. Reviving the pedagogical vision of John Ferguson Weir to teach all the fine arts under a single roof, the Art and Architecture Building was a complex spatial array of studios crafted to accommodate the various disciplines, but arranged in a composition of interpenetrating volumes intended to foster an interdisciplinary exchange of ideas between students. Rudolph hoped the proximity of the arts would bring a common understanding. Unfortunately, it had quite the opposite effect. Rudolph had consulted with Albers in planning the building, but a lot had changed in the 5 years it took to design and build the A&A. A revolution in the arts had occurred, and Albers' conception of painting as a controlled act on a small square canvas had become outdated. Students were working on gestural wall-sized canvases or throwing painting on canvas on the ground, which Albers called schmiererai, by the way. A group of student artists refused to work in the building and exiled themselves to a satellite studio. At the building's formal dedication on November 9, 1963, 2 weeks or so before President Kennedy was assassinated, German-born English architecture historian Sir Nicholas Pevsner gave the keynote address, delivering a not-so-thinly veiled attack on the design and on Rudolph, beseeching students to avoid imitating the new building or its architect. It was quite a talk. Rudolph was deeply hurt and at that moment decided to leave the school, not surprisingly, indeed to quit teaching altogether. Paul Rudolph left on June 30th, 1965, about the time when what is referred to as the 60s really began. Rudolph was succeeded by little-known West Coast architect Charles Moore, whose Casper Milquetoast official portrait belied his soon-to-be transformed persona into hipster Charles Moore. Moore's appointment coincided with rising student activism that resulted in a disciplinary shift from heroic form-making toward a historically and contextually referential approach that would come to be labeled postmodernism. Amidst the tumult of the late 1960s, on the campus here at Harvard, Kent State, Columbia first, Moore was, depending on whom you ask, either the best man for the job or the absolute worst. Certainly, his was a very different sensibility from Rudolph's, as is evident in their houses and in the press they received. Rudolph's spatially complex New Haven residence on High Street was published in Vogue in 1962, photographed during a stylish and carefully staged cocktail party. Moore's New Haven house was presented in Playboy, also carefully staged, as a swinging pad replete with lounging models. That wasn't his taste. Moore had little love for the Art and Architecture Building, which he deemed to be overbearing. What in 1963 was admired as the supreme symbol of the hero architect had by 1968 become the symbol of the architect as social oppressor. Moore permitted students to construct their own workspaces, transforming the architecture studio into a virtual favela, as we see in these pictures by Roy Berkeley that sent shockwaves through older alumni and the profession when published in Architectural Forum in 1967. When asked why he allowed students to treat the building so poorly, Moore dryly replied, "It has occurred to me for some time that an architecture school was a place where people were trying to be architects. So he said. Moore did more than just combat Rudolph's building. He also redirected the curriculum in recognition of a broader definition of architecture and the role of architects in society. He encouraged students to pursue experimental design, research, and construction methods, and initiated several key programs that are still a central part of the school, including the independent research-based MED program, which in its formative years was largely shaped by students like William Mitchell, who helped organize at Yale one of the first symposiums on the use of computers in architecture and would go on to become dean at MIT. Donald Watson, another key member of the first MED class, would later lead the program for years before becoming dean at Rensselaer Polytechnic. Moore principally focused on the core studios, encouraging students to experiment with new building materials, as I said, such as the foam houses built under the direction of Felix Drury. They were built on the Yale golf course, one of his first faculty hires. Drury's experimental projects were embraced by many students still imbued with the department's traditional emphasis on form making and the importance of building. But some believed that their time would be better spent on more socially relevant design and planning projects. In response to these growing concerns, Moore introduced what is now known as the Jim Vlock First-Year Building Project, which took students and faculty out of the classroom and into the job site to design and construct real projects that addressed pressing community needs. You see him digging a latrine in that photo. Even Moore got into the act. Here are some recent buildings in the program. The program started in rural Appalachia, but since 1989, students have worked with nonprofit developers to build an affordable house every year in New Haven, where their work is desperately needed and usually appreciated. The late 1960s was tumultuous. Architecture students who were particularly vocal in challenging authority commissioned a countercultural monument from Klaus Oldenburg, a Yale College graduate, I might point out, and staged various protests in opposition to a lack of financial aid, familiar theme, including a mock funeral of the unknown A&A student and a mock auction of the university's art collection, led as auctioneer by John Jacobson, now Associate Dean. Was he surprised when we found that photo? Tragically, incendiary rhetoric gave way to literal fire on June 14, 1969. No one was hurt, and the fire was quickly controlled, but the damage was significant. Because of the rebellious mood of the times, arson was suspected, but never proven. The fire left the building with wounds that would take more than 30 years to heal. Until repairs could be made, students were spread out across the campus, chipping away at the school's cherished cohesiveness. Despite the chaos, many students managed to produce serious work. And here, a 1965 project for innovative modular housing by Doug Michaels and Craig Hodgetts, who were inspired by James Stirling and the experimental architects of the English Archigram Group. Not everyone was on board with such designs or with the proclamations and manifestos that frequently replaced solid work. Philip Johnson supposedly walked out of review saying, "I'm not going to look at any more of this shit." But that's all part of the joy of a diverse curriculum. Equal in significance to the socially responsive first-year building project was the replacement of the masterpiece design theses of the Rudolph era with theme-based advanced studios. These can be attributed to the influence of Serge Chimaev and especially to the succession of 3 studios led by Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown, most famously 1968's Learning from Las Vegas, which challenged students to analyze the desert city as if it was Rome, an unorthodox assignment that offered students a way to see the world as it is, not as hero architects would wish to remake it. The rest of the 1960s, the late 60s, initially pointed to a re-examination of prevailing architectural pedagogy. But at Yale, as at most other radicalized architecture schools, these reforms were never fully implemented. When the harsh political and economic realities of the 1970s dampened the radical exuberance of the previous decade. In 1969, the art and architecture programs were academically separated into 2 distinct graduate schools, though they still shared a building, thus bringing to rest Beaux-Arts and Bauhaus dreams of integrated programs in the arts. A year later, Charles Moore stepped down as dean of the newly independent school, and in 1971, Herman D.J. Spiegel, an architectural engineer who had been teaching in the department since 1955, was put in charge. Spiegel saw his role as that of a manager responsible for getting a demoralized program back on track. Beyond the burned-out building, there were troubles in the Department of City Planning, leading to its termination, and to rumors that President Kingman Brewster was intent on closing the entire school down. There were also productive but complicated separatist movements within the school, such as the Black Workshop. Herman Spiegel did a yeoman's job getting things back on track, but alumni lobbied for his replacement with a practicing architect. When Spiegel stepped down in 1976, he proposed that Cesar Pelli succeed him. Pelli, who had previously worked with Eero Saarinen on the Morse and Stiles colleges, and had led 2 successful advanced studios at Yale, regarded the school as an institution primed for positive change. Working with very limited resources at a time when the university's endowment was barely able to cover operating expenses, Pelli shifted the emphasis from countercultural gesturing to solid academics, adding something that had previously been anathema at Yale, theory. Efforts were also made to increase diversity. While there were a handful of women in the program at any given time after World War II, in the 1970s, there was a significant increase in the presence of women students, including Sarah Caples, Elizabeth Plater-Zyberg, Louise Braverman, and Marion Weiss, as well as women faculty, including alumna M.J. Long and Andrea Lears. All these changes were tracked in the pages of a new publication, Retrospecta, which Pelli initiated as a modest 7-page pamphlet and has since developed into a robust record of student work. During this time, English architect James Stirling, first invited by Paul Rudolph to teach at Yale in 1959, flourished as inaugural Davenport visiting professor, occupying the chair from 1966 until 1984. The visiting critic system was further strengthened with the addition of new chaired professors, ensuring that Yale's pluralism was reinforced by visitors teaching in the design studios. Under Pelli, the school encouraged a greater freedom of aesthetic expression than ever before. And he gave the school a great gift lost since Rudolph's days, the sense that it was the center of architecture culture, as can be seen in this photograph of studio critics from 1980. Charles Moore, Jack Robertson, a graduate of the Rudolph era, who returned to teach, King Louis Wu, Mark Simon, a graduate of the school under Moore, Fred Clark, Pelley's design partner, and George Rinaldi, I'm happy to see is here with us tonight, a Harvard graduate seen holding his head in apparent pain, possibly in response to a comment by Peter Eisenman. While students were challenged by the diverse visiting critics, they were also challenged by their physical surroundings. In 1970, the burned-out A&A was renovated by William DeCassi, a former employee and student of Paul Rudolph, and renovated once again in 1974 when health considerations mandated the removal of the building's sprayed-on, exposed asbestos ceilings. After a serious fire and several rounds of ad hoc changes, the building, had to say the least, lost much of its original magic. However, under Pelley and then under Tom Beebe, who succeeded him as dean in 1985, students began to reappreciate the building. Chicago-based architect Thomas Beebe, class of 1965, was the first graduate of the school to serve as its leader. Despite the events of the intervening decades, Beebe had felt that not much had changed since his student days when he studied under Rudolph and Chermayeff. While Pelley concentrated on the advanced studios, Beebe, who had experienced a highly focused undergraduate program at Cornell before coming to Yale, concentrated on bringing greater discipline to the introductory studios, the so-called core, in order to make certain that Yale graduates had basic professional skills, which many from the post-Rudolph years definitely lacked. After experiencing the reinvigorated core, Beebe enabled students to choose between innovation-minded visiting critics like Frank Gehry and Bernard Tschumi, and tradition-based visitors like Thomas Gordon Smith, Leon Krier, and Dimitri Porphyrios. Significantly, new courses in history were made available, such as theories of architectural order and the architect's use of architectural history. The change in focus was startling. No longer were students just discussing the implicit classicism of modernist architecture, but were actively embracing the language of classical architecture itself. During this time, students also began to appreciate the school's history, particularly that of the Art and Architecture building. In 1988, to honor the A&A's 25th anniversary, a group of students that included Gil Schaefer and Roberta d'Alba initiated an exhibition of Rudolph's drawings of the building. Rudolph was famously reluctant to visit or even discuss the A&A after he had left Yale. But at this time, he made an exception, inviting the student curators to his New York apartment to discuss the building. The exhibition temporarily restored the gallery, removing partitions installed by the art school to reveal to many for the first time a glimmer of what the A&A building had been in its glorious years. As had been the case with Pelley, the pressures of professional practice led Thomas Beebe to resign after 7 years. I think the phrase is in movies, the 7-year itch, if you remember that movie, Tom Ewell and Marilyn Monroe. There must be somebody old enough to remember that movie. And in 1993, Fred Coder, who had briefly served on the faculty in the mid-'70s, was appointed Beebe's successor. Coder had a strong interest, and Fred is with us tonight, in urban design that affected the school's focus, including the introduction of the Urban Design Workshop, a community-oriented planning consultancy run by Alan Plattis. It was just the right time to return urbanism to Yale, given that in the early 1990s marked a significant moment of transition from the historically tense relationship between Yale and the city of New Haven to a new spirit of cooperation resulting from the efforts of the newly appointed university president, Richard Levin, and the newly elected New Haven mayor, John DeStefano. While broadening the scope of the school's interests, Coder also helped lay the groundwork for an extensive renovation of the Art and Architecture building, as well as other key arts buildings. School of Architecture alumnus James Polshek was hired to produce a detailed plan for the arts area, the first such plan since Feldman's 1919 proposal. For architecture students, the most critical element of this plan was a partial renovation of the A&A to address the most glaring structural and environmental problems, for which a new glazing scheme was developed by alumnus Fred Bland, who's in, I believe, with us tonight, with Paul Rudolph. But when the interim renovation was completed in 1994, it became clear that a truly comprehensive rehabilitation was called for. Fred Coder stepped down from the deanship in 1998, but like BB, remained on the faculty. After a contentious search for a replacement, I was appointed dean of the school. Those were happy days. And the fur began to fly, with fears of an imposed traditionalist agenda in the studios and in the matter of the A&A's expansion, as illustrated by this anonymous sketch that appeared in my office. I would have done a better job. Nothing was further from my intentions. The only tradition I was dedicated to was reinvigorating the school's time-honored commitment to design diversity and to the revival of its role as a crossroads of ideas, a role that I had enjoyed during my time as student in the 1960s. In 2000, the School of Art vacated the A&A for Holcomb Green Junior Hall, an existing building with a facade credited to Louis Kahn that was renovated and significantly added onto by faculty member Deborah Burke, whom I'm happy to say will succeed me as dean. With the art students in their own home, and thanks to a promise of funds from Yale College alumnus Sid Bass, the school was able to make plans to comprehensively overhaul the Art and Architecture building for its own exclusive use. A key component of the project was the construction of a new adjacent building, the Jeffrey A. Loria Center for Art History, which would provide essential services that Rudolph's building couldn't accommodate. Ultimately, Charles Gwathmey, architecture class of 1962, was selected to oversee the restoration of the A&A and the design of Loria. Gwathmey worked under severe time constraints. Design and construction schedules were accelerated to meet my insistence that the architecture program be out of the building for only 1 year. Given that post-professional students were only at Yale for 2 years, it was absolutely critical to me that they, along with every other student, experience the A&A as a student. In my view, a Yale education in architecture is not complete without being challenged and inspired by this building. In November 2008, as the stock market was on its gigantic tumble, almost exactly 45 years from the day of its dedication, the school celebrated the completion of the restored Art and Architecture building, renamed Paul Rudolph Hall at the request of Sid Bass. As the A&A building was restored, so too were some forgotten or neglected cultural and academic traditions. A significant increase in endowments, as President Salovey pointed out, has made it possible to increase financial aid, to expand the visiting critic system with new chaired professorships, to support student travel, to put other programs such as symposia and publications on solid financial footing. Courses and study opportunities for undergraduates were also strengthened, and the school's curriculum evolved with interdisciplinary joint programs, and in 2008, a PhD program distinguished from other programs by the requirement that candidates be trained architects with at least 2 years of professional experience. Today, as throughout Yale's history, the school seeks to balance core competence with artistic experimentation and remains unwavering in the belief that the primary purpose of an architecture school should be training for leadership in the practice of the art of architecture. In many architecture schools today, theory is more prevalent than history, while hand drawing and physical models have been abandoned in favor of digital methods that encourage, even demand, speculative investigation into radical forms divorced from tectonic authority. New ideas and technologies are exciting and important to the future of architecture. But in this new landscape, it can be easy to lose sight of the fact that the principal purpose of an architecture school is to prepare students for the diverse disciplinary realities of architecture that is first and foremost the art of building. The Yale School of Architecture was the place where the Beaux-Arts model of an integrated school of fine arts first came to America, where for a short time the interdisciplinary dream of an American Bauhaus flourished, where the cult of heroic form-making reached an apotheosis, where the seeds of postmodernism and new urbanism were planted. But the measure of this school has never been in a regimented uniformity of any single style, method, or ideology. This is not to say that Yale, because it embraces contradictory points of view, is rudderless. Far from it. It means that by exposing students to different ideas and by testing their own ideas against those of the past, Yale has encouraged, and I believe continues to encourage, students to think for themselves as they master the skills they need to pursue a life in architecture. While most of the leading schools of architecture have careened from one ism to another, Yale has always been receptive to the simultaneous promotion of contradictory ideas while adhering to a set of core beliefs, ideals even. We believe in the value of making things. We embrace theories that are rooted in practice. We believe that tradition can inform new ideas and that encouraging collaboration is just as important as fostering individual talent. We believe in the idea of the singular masterpiece, yet we strive to create buildings that can shape a community. Above all, we have an unwavering belief in architecture as a deeply humanist pursuit. I am grateful for the opportunity to have shared this history with you today, and honored to be part of the first 100 years of architecture education at Yale. As we celebrate its past, let us also salute its future. Thank you, and please join me and others for refreshments in the Architecture Gallery, where you may tour the exhibit, and of course, where Jimmy Stamp and I will be thrilled to sign copies of our book. Thank you very much.